January 6th committee chair Benny Thompson says he believes the panel conducted its last interview on Wednesday, and a final report is expected later this month. CBS News confirmed the DOJ has reached out to former Vice President Mike Pence in the department's ongoing investigation into the events surrounding January 6th and the 2020 presidential election. The former vice president has received the request and is reviewing it. And for more, let's bring in Marc Short. He's the former chief of staff to former Vice President Mike Pence. Good to see you. I want to ask a little bit about the DOJ investigation to January 6th. Do you think that the former vice president will talk with prosecutors?
Caitlin, I really have to refer that question to Pence's lawyer, Emmett Flood, for questions about that.
I know that you have spoken to them, though. Would you advise the former vice president to speak to them?
You know, I think that there are really profound questions about speech and debate clause here. But I also think that the reality is that the vice president understands that there's a difference between a January 6th congressional investigation where, you know, he felt very strongly about a separation of power and that there was not the same sort of, that having served in Congress for 12 years, he knew what the role of Congress was, and sort of investigations that don't have criminal aspects to them are different than a DOJ investigation. But I also think, you know, that there is concern about naming a special counsel at this point. And I think, you know, when Merrick Garland wants to portray this as if there's an independent special counsel detached from DOJ, they've been doing this investigation for 2 years, Caitlin. It's not like it's a brand new investigation. They're pretty far down a path. And so it seems like a pretty strong deflection to sort of push this now on to saying whatever comes forward is a special counsel's decision and not owned by DOJ.
But I guess the main difference between a congressional one and a federal one is that you couldn't essentially evade it, or you're suggesting that Pence would be maybe more inclined to participate with the federal investigation.
I don't want to suggest, because I really think that's a conversation between DOJ and Pence's lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer, but there is definitely, as you say, there's a difference between a investigation from Congress that is more information gathering versus something that could become a criminal investigation.
I want to ask about this latest controversy surrounding the former president and his dining with Nick Fuentes and Kanye West. Kanye West, of course, went on Alex Jones' conspiracy show today, going on another anti-Semitic rant. You have said that the former president has kind of gone into the heart of darkness, as you described it. As the former vice president is looking at all of this, do you think that he may be more compelled to run because of these latest controversies?
Oh, I don't think that factors into a decision. I think the vice president himself has commented about his disappointment that the president had entertained these folks at Mar-a-Lago, and I think you've heard him call for the president to apologize for having such anti-Semitic rhetoric there expressed by those individuals. But I don't think that factors into this. I think as he looks at what is next and where he can be called to serve, he's more interested in what the American people are saying, what he's hearing, and what they're looking for in leadership. And I think that what he hears consistently is an affection for the Trump-Pence policies, but looking for a different type of leadership that can unite this country.
Do you think that, given the criticisms of the former president and Republicans trying to figure out a way to move beyond him, when you're looking at the 2024 field, do you think it would benefit Republicans to rally around one candidate early and avoid kind of a wider field? Or do you think that a lot of people should jump in?
You know, I think that often we here in D.C. try to game board this. And I think the reality is that the voters will choose. And I think that nothing really matters until you actually begin the process, begin getting into debates and getting feedback from voters in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, across the country.
Speaking of those states, does the former vice president have plans to visit?
He's visited them many times, this year, and it was part of the book rollout that he's excited, the success he's enjoyed with that. He'll be doing book signings in New Hampshire and South Carolina in the next couple of weeks.
And any sort of timeline about when he will make this decision?
No, I don't think there's an artificial timeline for him. I think, as he's mentioned, that he and his family will gather over the Christmas holiday and talk about the future that they see and where they think they can be called to serve the American people.
And what exactly would be his path if he were to run?
I'm not sure that I accept the notion that there's like a specific path for people. Again, I think we here in D.C. we're sort of often provided these sort of forums, or people around town are paid to do that. But I think the reality is that it's more about where the American people are calling and what they're looking for. And as he travels, he hears people saying, we love the policies. We're looking for different leadership that can unite our country because we're actually not as divided as the politics in D.C. are.
I mean, in that sense, do you think the book tour has kind of given him a sense of support, a sense of a constituency?
I think the book tour has been great because I think he viewed, ending his term as vice president, that it's appropriate for people to step back from the public eye for a bit. And the book tour has allowed him to come back out and do a lot of interviews and talk to the American people about what he's hearing and what he offers them.
All right, Marc Short, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.